So today's webinar for school counselors is Counseling Families with Unique Circumstances. This is a webinar that we do every year, and it's great. We usually try to get a few people from different colleges, different types of colleges on the line with us to help answer some of those tricky questions that families run into. So not your typical scenarios, different things that pop up that might be tricky to answer. So we're going to go through all those good things and hear lots of examples from our panelists. Oops. So before I get started, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Stephanie Wells. I'm Director of Community Outreach at MEFA. I've been here since 2001, so quite a while. And I work with lots of colleges and community-based organizations and high schools, and I do a lot of presentations out in the community, working with families. And of course, lots of webinars here on behalf of MEFA. For those of you who are just logging in, I just want to let you know we are recording the webinar. And in the little menu option for the webinar, there should be a little handout tab. So you can see that, and the handout is a PDF of the PowerPoint. If you can't access that for whatever reason, don't worry, I will email the PowerPoint as well to everybody after the webinar, and we are recording it. So feel free to send questions through the chat feature. So I am going to let our panelists introduce themselves and just say a quick hello. So we'll get started with Sherry Avery. If you want to just say hello, Sherry.
Hello. Do you want me to say anything more than that?
Yeah, just how long have you been at Brandeis?
Okay.
Just a quick little
Sure. I've been in financial aid and at Brandeis for 23 years. Started as a work-study student, so I've been on all different sides of the equation. And I oversee financial aid, student accounts, and student employment.
Excellent. And Carla, welcome. Oh, Carla, can you hear us? Okay, let's see.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yep, great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Carla Mincello. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Framingham State University. I have been in financial aid for 24 years, and I've been at Framingham since last June, and prior to that, I worked primarily at private institutions.
Excellent. Thanks, Carla. And Amy, welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Prietti. I'm the coordinator of financial aid at Greenfield Community College, and apparently I'm the rookie on the panel. I've been in financial aid for 13 years, most of that here at GCC, and I also have a number of different experiences in higher education administration in general, mostly in housing and residence life.
Excellent. Thanks, Amy, and thanks for taking the time out, all three of you today. I know it's a busy time of year reading freshman award letters and trying to get them packaged, so we appreciate you taking the time. So just a little bit about MEFA. I think everybody knows who we are, but just a few quick things. We do have a lot of great information on MEFA.org, so feel free to share that information with families. A link to MEFA on your website is great. It'd be helpful for families to be able to access that in all different ways, shapes, and forms. And definitely follow us on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. We're always sharing great information on our social media networks. Most of you probably do get the emails from MEFA, but if not, you can find them on the school counselor page. So I am going to show you that page real quick before we get started, because I want you to be able to see some of the tools that are here for you. So right here is your dedicated school counselor page. You can see if we scroll down, lots of different handouts and virtual kits that you can use for families. So feel free to check all of these tools out. We're always adding new information for families, information on how to promote your seminars if you're hosting a seminar with MEFA. And one other thing I wanted to point out, if you go under trainings and events, you'll see the PDP certification. So if you click on that link, you'll see our PDP requirements and all the instructions on how to get your PDPs. So you can get all of that right there. And then also your evidence of learning form, which you can fill out after the webinar or as you go. It's up to you how you want to do that if you do need to collect PDPs. But we have our evidence of learning form for the webinar right there on the website as well. So I just wanted to share that with everybody, make sure everybody knew where all of those great tools live. Okay, so here's some of the topics we're going to focus on today, really focusing on independent students, what makes a student independent, what are the different rules and regulations surrounding that. Undocumented students, I know a lot of the questions we got before the webinar really wanted us to focus in on that, so we will definitely talk about that a lot. I will tell you that on the page I just showed you, the school counselor page, we do have a great recorded webinar on international and undocumented students. So definitely take a look at that. Everything you need to know about how to help this group of students is right there on that webinar. So we'll get into some of those issues today, but the real nitty-gritty is a lot of it is on that webinar as well. So feel free to take a look at that webinar. And our non-traditional families, as well as special circumstances. What do colleges look at when they're reviewing financial aid appeals, and how does that process work? So that's where we're going to focus our efforts today. So federally independent students, we're going to start off with Amy because she sees a lot of these students here at GCC. So she's going to just walk us through what makes a student independent automatically, and then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of the things that students can look at if they are not automatically considered an independent student when they're filling out the FAFSA. So I'm going to turn it right over to you, Amy.
Sure. So primarily, you're going to find that a student is needing to provide parent information on the FAFSA unless they are 25 or older. And then on the slide there, you can see where the exemptions come into play. And, a student that you're working with, yeah, they might be married. They're probably not going to be a graduate student. The active duty and the veteran thing is really important to understand that many of our students come to us and they are in the Massachusetts National Guard, and that does not necessarily count as an exemption. There's some other pieces that we would need to work through to determine whether or not they would still need parent information. Most of our students who are in just the National Guard are still considered to be dependent students, so that's an important thing to understand. And especially at the community college level, we regularly are dealing with those bullets in the second column there on the slide. Students in foster care or whose family situation is significantly deteriorated because parents are deceased or they're just not in the picture at all. Massachusetts technically doesn't have emancipated minors, but you might come across that. Legal guardianship, and then unaccompanied homeless youth or those at risk of being homeless. All of those, at least in my work, I'm dealing with those at least once a week. Some situation comes up with these students. And in every case here, the financial aid office is required to ask for documentation of the circumstances. And so this is, we often have students who come in expecting that because they don't live with their parents, that they are not required to provide parent information, or because their parents aren't willing to pay for college, that then they don't need to provide parent information. And neither of those are correct. They would still need to provide parent information on the FAFSA. And the only other thing I would add here is when I'm working with a student who has said that they have no support from a parent, and that there's really not a relationship at all with the parent, and we need to dig into that further to see if they qualify for an exemption. The first question that I will ask that student is where their health insurance comes from, because many parents may not regularly speak to a child. They may not even be living with them. They might be living with another family in the area, especially if they're still in high school. But they may still be willing to pay for their health insurance through their work. And that's a real indicator of how much of a breakdown there is in the family situation. And that's kind of where we start those conversations if there's not a clear path to independent status for a student that's under the age of 24.
Great. So, Amy, let me ask you a quick question. So if mom or dad is paying for health insurance, typically that wouldn't, the student wouldn't be considered independent?
At least not for us. And, you know, this is where you get into some interesting situations from school to school. Some schools may not ask that question at all, but for us, we really feel like that is kind of a baseline, that if they are still getting health insurance that way, there is, you know, some connection to the parent. The parent's still willing to pay for that coverage, whether it's privately or through their work or through their Mass Health for that student. And so for us, that does not define a clear breakdown in the family unit.
Great. Well,
Yeah, we will work with the student to get connected to a community agency that will help them get independent insurance, but we wouldn't do a dependency override based on that.
Great. Well, let's ask our other two colleges on the panel. Sherry, do you run into this very often, or how would you handle that situation?
Yes, so we don't have a lot of students who qualify for independent status under the federal guidelines, but we do have a handful, so definitely we're not seeing it as often as Amy is. We have a number, we've encountered the unaccompanied youth who was homeless, or at risk of being homeless, actually a couple of times this year. So that one is definitely becoming more prevalent. And as Amy said, we require documentation from the school system and usually some third-party letters and statements from the student and things like that. Legal guardianship we see occasionally, and on the institutional side, so they're independent for federal purposes, but on the institutional side, we would still consider them to be dependent on that legal guardian. So we would require information from the legal guardian for purposes of our own institutional monies. And we do occasionally see some foster care cases and things like that, but definitely not at the same level that Amy's seeing.
Great. And how about you, Carla?
We have quite a few independent students, but our students that are federally independent, most often it's for the reasons of they're 24 or older, they're married, or sometimes they have children. We have had many students that have been in foster care or legal guardianship, and we do collect documentation of that. And that's pretty much it. We don't get a lot of requests for dependency overrides. When we do get them, we don't approve a lot of them because we do require quite a bit of documentation from the student. And you know, there's just very few situations where a dependency override is going to be approved, because it really does have to be a pretty extreme situation that the student can document with third-party documentation as well as a letter from the student. And you know, there just aren't that many situations that fit those guidelines.
Great. Well, let's talk about dependency overrides, because I did just get a question from a counselor who said that they advise students that if they're not living at home, that they should report themselves as homeless. But that's not necessarily always the case, I'm hearing. So let's talk about, Amy, do you want to continue on this dependency override, since you probably see a lot
Sure.
of these?
And I regularly work with high school guidance counselors or community client services managers from community agencies who are working with young people in that type of situation. And we will work with them directly to identify what are the circumstances, how can we document those, and of course we still ask about the health insurance piece. I don't want to harp on that, but we will work with them to get independent health insurance if we can determine that indeed they're really not in contact with their parent. If they are couch surfing with a friend or a significant other, even while in high school or after, they just really don't have a place to go regularly, we will work with them around documenting that and doing an independent FAFSA in that way. And if we need to help them get connected to community agencies that can help them with other services, we'll do that as well. I think we're probably in a different place with community colleges and how we function, and sometimes the line between being a social service agency and being a college is a little blurred when you're dealing with our student population, but in reality, we feel very strongly that if we can help them gain access to higher education, we're helping the whole community, and so that's why we operate in that way.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Do you want to talk a little bit more about situations where the students who thought they would qualify as homeless, or counselors may have thought they would, maybe some of these examples on this slide, and then maybe some where they probably would qualify, maybe give some examples?
Sure. It's most common for us to see the ones in that left-hand column there. A student is really not connected to the parent because the parent doesn't want to pay for college, or they have some really incorrect information about tax filings and how that impacts dependency status. And we'll work with them to actually provide accurate information, and oftentimes that actually gets the FAFSA filed with the parent information on it, because there's really, I often say my job in financial aid is about explaining what financial aid is not more than it is explaining what financial aid is. And that really helps families to feel better about what their obligation is when they're filling out a FAFSA with a child. Many families just are not in a position to contribute in a significant way, but they're worried about providing information and then being forced to contribute. So you kind of work with them on that piece. And students who, dependency overrides, like Carla said, we don't often do dependency overrides anymore. And I'll explain why that has really evolved for us. I'm not sure if this is the reason that Carla would cite, but at the community college level, where access to higher education is much more affordable, what we find is that students who really are kind of living on the edges, they don't have a permanent place to go, they have really no connection to a family unit, and they want higher education, but they're not really sure how to pursue that. There may be issues with being in recovery from drug and alcohol abuse, or there may be any number of other issues related to us just being in Greenfield. We're in a very rural area where people are very place-bound. So we will work with students to really document what is happening. And oftentimes what we find is that when we talk to them and we can document the situation, they fall into the category of those questions around dependency for unaccompanied homeless youth. They're under the age of 21, they're under the age of 24 is a little harder, but they're under the age of 24 or 21, and they have not had a secure place to live or any sort of support mechanism in terms of family for a number of years. And we would work with them actually around being documented as a homeless youth.
Excellent, great. And Carla, did you have anything you want to add to that?
No, not too much. But I mean, we sometimes see people that think they should get an independency override where they don't really need one. We'll have situations where like a student is living with an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, but they never went through the process of getting legal guardianship. And they may still have contact with their parents. They just don't live with them anymore. So a lot of times those students, don't want to sort of bother the parents to fill out the form. They just want to do everything on their own. And that's not something, if they still have contact with the family and can get the information, we wouldn't approve a dependency override for them, but we would work with them on getting the information that they need from their parents. And a lot of times they're able to do that. I've also seen cases where students have parents who live in another country. They've maybe come over here to live with relatives, and there's I've seen sometimes an assumption both at the high schools and with the student that just because the parent lives in another country, they don't have to provide information on the form, and that isn't true. If there is a way to contact the parent, you still need to try to get their information on the form. So we've worked with students in that situation as well. The types of cases where we would consider doing dependency override would be a case where the parent is gone. No one knows where the parent is. No one's seen the parent in a long time. There's no contact. Abuse, certainly if there's documented abuse, and we can get paperwork of that, we would certainly consider a dependency override in a case like that. And the cases where we've done them, I think those are the sorts of situations that we deal with.
Okay, great. So speaking of documentation, Sherry, I'll start with you on this one. What sort of things are you guys looking for? I'll start with Sherry on dependency overrides. We have a few on this bullet right here.
Yeah, we do require a lot of documentation to make someone independent, and as Amy and Carla were both saying, we don't do a lot of these because the burden of proof ends up not really being there. A lot of the times it turns out that the family just doesn't want to, or as Amy said, they feel if they provide it, then they're going to be legally obligated to contribute. And so a lot of those situations end up working themselves out with a little bit of education. But we've definitely had some cases, some abuse cases, some abandonment cases, some homeless cases. And so what we would definitely require is a letter from the student explaining the situation, some third-party documentation. So if there's an abuse situation, we would want some court records or records from police, the police reports, things like that. Maybe a psychologist who knows what's been going on with the family. Definitely things from non-family members that are a little bit more. What's the word I'm looking for?
Objective.
Yeah, thank you. Like a little more objective than just, the grandmother writing something or something like that. So we ask for a lot of documentation. We definitely do approve some of these with the proper documentation. But yeah, everything on this slide, we would absolutely ask for all of these. Sometimes we might, in the case of abandonment or something like that, we might ask for the student to provide some proof that they've been self-sufficient, like how have they been providing support for themselves, because sometimes there's another family member who might be providing support for themselves. So even if they might meet the burden of proof for being independent for federal purposes, it may not mean that we consider them independent for our institutional scholarship purposes. So sometimes if they are living with that grandparent and we decide we don't need the information for the FAFSA, we may want the grandparents' information because they've been supporting the student for the last 10 years or whatever the case may be. So sometimes it doesn't go, it may not be a dependency override for both the school and for federal aid.
Great. Well, Sherry, I have a very specific question from one of our counselors that rolls right into what you're saying. So I think I know the answer, but I'll let you answer it. But so it says, what if one of the parents is deceased and the other parent has been missing for over 10 years? And the grandparents adopted the child before they turned 13. So that key right there is the 13 years old. So I'm going to let you answer that one.
Yeah, so if the grandparent adopted, then we would be looking at the grandparent as the parent at that point.
Right.
And yeah, so we would be asking for the financial information from that grandparent because they are now considered the parent as the adoptive parent.
Right, but if they did not adopt the child, if they were the legal guardians.
Right, you're right. So if it adopted, we definitely would be looking at, for legal guardians, they would not be on the FAFSA, but they would be considered independent for the federal aid. At Brandeis, though, we would want the information from that grandparent for purposes of our money.
Great, that's what I thought. But
so on the profile, we'd want the legal guardian information.
Great, excellent. Amy, did you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, it's very similar, except we don't have any institutional aid. Right. So we're really looking at state and federal aid. There's a small amount of institutional aid that we are only as a policy packaging for students who are eligible for the federal aid, and that is usually gone It's been gone since July, if that helps you for this academic year. And when a student's adopted, the adopted parent is the parent. That's the easiest way for me to say it.
Right.
If the student's in legal guardianship, we are going to ask for that documentation, and then they are independent. And we don't have a separate, we're not doing a profile, we're not doing a separate set of policies or measurements for how we would give out aid from the institution. We just handle it. It's a much more direct and simple process than what a place like Brandeis is doing.
Right, right. And Carla, I'm guessing you're probably along the same lines, but
yeah, we if a student is federally independent because they're in legal guardianship or meet one of the other criteria, then we treat them as an independent student, both institutionally and federally. But, you know, similar to Amy, we don't have a lot of institutional aid here. When I worked at private schools where we had a lot of institutional aid and we used institutional methodology, we would treat these on a case-by-case basis.
Oh,
so
okay.
In some cases, we would require documentation from the legal guardian, and in some cases, we wouldn't. And it really just depended on the situation, depended on how long the student had been in legal guardianship and living with that guardian, and, you know, things like that. So we really sort of took a look at those on an individual basis and decided what to do with them.
Excellent. Great. Okay, well, let's move on to the next topic, which I know a lot of folks wanted to talk about, undocumented students. And we're going to have Sherry kick this one off, but before we do, I just wanted to point to you all a guide, and I have a hyperlink on the PowerPoint, a federal resource guide that is on the federal department's website. It is a booklet almost. It's a pretty long PDF. It's 63 pages. And it is still on the department's website. I did check before our webinar to make sure it was still on there. And this is an excellent guide to have on hand as a counselor. It really is robust and has a lot of good information in there. So feel free to download that. It could be a good tool for you to have. I know we've sent it out in some of our counselor emails as well, but I did want to point that out to you before I turn this over to Sherry about undocumented students and how things are going to work at a private college. We have institutional aid, and then we'll talk about the publics and how it works on that end.
Yeah, so at Brandeis, we're very lucky to have funds here to support undocumented students. So as you all may know, undocumented students are not eligible for any kind of federal or state funding. So for them to receive assistance to go to a college like Brandeis, you really need to have buy-in from the school to support the financial needs of these students. So we have been very lucky to be able to meet full need for these students using institutional scholarship and a institutional loan program. So they're small amounts of loans, but a small amount of loan. And if they are eligible for DACA, at least as of the present moment, we also offer them a work award to meet that need. And we have them fill out the profile just like every other student so that we can determine what their need is, and we collect documentation of their income just like every other student so we can determine what their need is. And then, as I said, we meet all of that need with a combination of institutional loan and work and scholarship. So we do have quite a few undocumented students on our campus. Lately, it's been really difficult for these students. We've been meeting with a lot of them who have been very worried about losing their DACA status with everything going on. So there's definitely a lot more counseling involved for them and making them know that they're in a safe space on our campus. And we talk with all of them about how to get through the 4 years. They reapply for aid each year, and we're committed to meeting their need each year so that they don't have to worry about our Brandeis policy is not going to change even if things change in the country regarding DACA. We're still committed to supporting these students.
Excellent. And Carla, how about you? How are things going with undocumented students at Framingham State?
So we don't have a lot of DACA or undocumented students here. We have a few that I know of. We probably have some that we don't know about because they don't necessarily apply for financial aid since they're really not eligible for most types. So of the few DACA students I'm aware of, some of those students qualify for the Adams Scholarship. Some of them are commuters, and because we're a lower cost institution, they've been able to afford the tuition without a lot of assistance. And then we do have a few small endowed institutional funds that we're able to give to some of those students. You know, I don't know what will happen if DACA is not renewed, if it goes away. I'm not sure how that will affect things for those students. And obviously, DACA students have a little more eligibility and more options than undocumented students do. So, but of the students that I know of that are here that are in that status, many of them just sort of, you know, go to school and work their way through school and are able to pay the tuition and fees with the help of family and other options.
Right, and it is great in Massachusetts for, at least for the DACA kids, that they do get that in-state tuition. And if they worked hard, which we know many of them are very hard workers, very bright, very successful, they're getting the Adams Scholarship as well. So they're eligible for that free tuition at a public college. So at least here in Massachusetts is a little bit of a benefit here. Amy, how about over at Greenfield Community College?
So that I know of, we have, based on my questions to our admission office, we have around 24 students that have the deferred action status. We're not tracking that in any specific way other than they are eligible for the in-state tuition piece, as you mentioned. And we're not looking at any other students and asking really any questions about that. So I don't have information about who might be undocumented. And if they're a student here, the one path to financial assistance would be what we call our foundation scholarships, or the institutional scholarship program that we have, that they would need, depending upon the specific scholarship, between 1 and 2 semesters at GCC before they could apply for and receive those. And that would be really the only form of aid.
Great. And I guess the question that we get at MEFA all the time from these students is how are we going to make things work? You know, they get all these acceptances and it's a lot of great news, but then how are they going to pay for it? Because they're not eligible for federal or state aid, including the DACA kids, except for the Adams Scholarship. We know they can apply and be admitted, but then how are they going to pay for it? Now, as Sherry mentioned, at some of the private colleges, especially some of the elite private colleges that are able to fully fund students, it's a little bit easier because they have the resources to help these students. But we often see students who are looking at private colleges that aren't fully funding them, or even, you know, a state university, maybe out of state, where, you know, the cost is just a lot and it's going to be difficult to swing. So we do have resources on the next slide that I'll point you to, but we often tell these students, we really do, if cost is an issue, we really do promote that in-state college path. So starting at the community college, particularly, the cost is low, get your core coursework done, and then move on to maybe one of the state public colleges or universities for students who, you know, might not be able to get into a Brandeis, for example. So that's some of the advice that we're giving students. But there are, you know, private scholarships in the community that students can apply for through the local high school. Typically, those don't have citizenship requirements. On the next slide, let's see here. Here's some resources.
Well, you make a good point, Stephanie, about the scholarships in the community, especially service organizations like a Rotary or Kiwanis or Lions Club. Those organizations often have a path for getting scholarships for students and are not asking about their status in the United States.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's really all we can do at this point, right?
Right.
So this next slide here, everybody will get this PowerPoint if you haven't downloaded it already. So you'll have these websites just to have somewhere to point students to. So undocumented students can reach out to these organizations. We also recommend that these students contact the multicultural recruiting coordinator at a college because they may know of additional scholarships or even just resources, groups, clubs that might help the student feel more at home, for example. They might want to also look at the college's mission and see, is it a school that is welcoming, like Brandeis was, Sherry was just talking about. Safety schools that might have merit scholarships. So not just need-based aid, but maybe merit scholarships, because we know that really doesn't have anything to do with their status. A local community scholarship. So there's some advocacy resources here that we recommend, as well as private funding sources that are for all students, regardless of their immigration status, but they definitely, can help students. They're reputable websites that you can point students to if you need a resource. Great. So I'll just mention to the audience that if you have any questions, feel free to send those through the chat feature, and we will answer those as we go. If I'm holding off on a question, it's because I know we have a slide coming up that will answer that question. So hold tight. But Carla, Sherry, anything else to add about the undocumented students or any resources that you know of on your campuses?
I don't have anything else to add.
Great.
No, me either.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's move on to non-traditional parent families. We'll talk a little bit about this. And Carla, if you want to start off on this one and just talk about the situations that you come across and how this would work on the FAFSA, and then maybe we'll have Sherry talk about the profile and how it works there, if we want to start off with Carla.
Yeah, we haven't seen too many unusual situations here in terms of non-traditional families, but one thing we have seen since the FAFSA started using prior year is that there seems to be more confusion among parents when reporting their marital status on the FAFSA. So we will have people, for the current academic year, we had people, because they were reporting 2015 tax information, we had a lot of families where the parent got remarried after 2015, and so had not filed a joint return for 2015, so they reported themselves as unmarried or single or divorced on the FAFSA. So, that led to us having to collect documentation later from the spouse that wasn't included the first time, the step-parent, and then having to change some awards. So there is a lot of confusion, I feel like, among families about what to report for their marital status when doing the FAFSA, and it is their current marital status as of the day that they're doing the form. So, that is something that we had to sort of follow up with a lot of families this year, and I think it might be a bit more confusing now because they've changed the FAFSA to use earlier tax data. Aside from that, sometimes we see families that are going through a divorce right now. And sometimes we will collect documentation from those families, additional documentation, so that we can get a better idea of the family's financial picture. And then the other thing that is sometimes confusing to families, I think, is that if the parents are unmarried but live together, they need to report the information for both parents. And that will usually mean that they can't use the IRS data retrieval when doing the FAFSA. So I think it's confusing for families. When we do financial aid nights, we try to explain it the best we can, but I imagine that as guidance counselors, you're probably getting questions about these things all the time.
Right, and that's a good point you made about the IRS data retrieval tool, because I did have a situation with a mom the other day that had used the IRS data retrieval tool, but she was divorced. So we don't want to include the ex-husband's income if they're no longer married. So it created quite a situation for that family. Sherry, do you want to talk about it from a profile point of view, and especially with the data retrieval tool on the FAFSA and how it can get a little tricky?
Sure. I feel like the profile made things a little bit easier for families this year. Instead of defining, I know the colleges are still using custodial versus non-custodial in our nomenclature, but they made it more household A and household B. And the questions that they ask the student and the family as they go through the profile makes it a little more clear which parent to put where. So I think they made some good changes this year regarding the language on that. For the profile also, the student should be reporting the custodial parent and the current spouse, and again, what their current marital status is. And then the non-custodial parent is now the household B, and a lot of colleges, Brandeis included, who require the profile, do request that non-custodial parent fill out the non-custodial profile and perhaps submit some other forms as well. And usually they want to see the spouse's income as well. So I'll say that we ask for the information about all the parents involved, so the new spouses, but we do, when we figure out how much the family contribution should be, we factor out the step parents for purposes of our own institutional scholarship. And that does vary from school to school. One thing that we deal a lot with is that bottom bullet point there about waivers. We get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of waiver requests a year. So we require students to fill out the non-custodial parent waiver form. We do have our own, but we also accept the one from the College Board. They put out a really nice one this year, trying to make things a little bit more similar from school to school so that they could fill out one and send it everywhere. We also require a statement from the student, and kind of like the dependency overrides, we ask for a third-party letter, preferably from a clergy person or a lawyer or a psychologist or a guidance counselor. In fact, guidance counselors are probably the #1 group of people we see sending those third-party letters in, and that's great. I will say, when you're writing those letters, a lot of what we see is, I've known this student for the last 4 years, and he told me his father doesn't, or his mother doesn't pay anything, which I'm sure, most of you probably only know what the student is telling you. It is helpful to know if you're able to ask the student a few more questions, more information than that. We may possibly reach back out for some more information or request a different third-party letter, but we need to have all of those things in place. And I'll say that we don't approve all of them. So it kind of goes back to the same thing with the dependency overrides. If that non-custodial parent is just saying, hey, I don't want to pay. If we say that there's a relationship there with the student, that they know how to contact them, that there's financial support, we're probably not going to waive that, but we will waive, or likely, we'll definitely waive an abuse situation if they can document that, and certainly if they don't know where the parent is, and there's no financial support, or if they're in arrears on child support, things like that. Those are situations where we would be much more inclined to waive, because it just makes sense. So the guidance community, you're all very important to that process, and we definitely see a lot of letters from all of you. So thank you for helping the students with this very difficult process.
That's great. Thank you, Sherry. And I wanted to point out a link on the PowerPoint to this great little graphic of Who's My Parent that's also on the Federal Student Aid website. So there's a link there, and that's something that you can always print out and hang up in your office if you wanted. So Sherry, I wanted to pick up on a point you just made about parents, because we did have a question about, whether it's a grandparent or a parent, whoever the adopted parent is, what if they just don't want to fill out the form? How do you handle that? Because I know that's not a good enough excuse, but we get it all the time. Do you mean
the custodial? Yeah, sure. The
custodial.
Custodial or non-custodial or both?
Let's just talk about custodial, whether it's for the FAFSA or the profile. Stick to custodial. Yeah.
So if the custodial parent just doesn't want to fill out the application, that's where we're most likely probably reviewing a request from the student to be made independent. And that's where we're making a decision about whether we can move forward with or without that information. And we're asking for the documentation. If it's just that the parent is unwilling to fill it out, but their health insurance being paid for, they're living in the house with the parent, they just don't want to do it, we can't consider that student for aid if it's just an unwillingness issue. And as I always explain to students and families, we are evaluating ability to contribute, not willingness.
Right, that's a good point. Amy, how about you?
Well, it's interesting. I'm listening here, and I would say that for the most part, there's no way I've come across every situation in terms of parent and how the households all exist or coexist. So we entertain all types of questions, and we see all types of definitions of who a parent is. And we often are having students fill out FAFSAs with a parent who's not actually a parent, providing information as the parent. And so we're often working with, backtracking through information and what they're doing. We don't do the profile. We regularly are working with families where the parents are living in the same household and not married, and advising them on that. But more than anything, we're working with all families on the anxiety around this, especially when there's a situation of remarriage or blended households of any type. There's a lot of anxiety about what is going to be asked of folks, especially when it's a step parent or a significant other of, but not a spouse of the parent in the household, and what's going to be asked of them. But other than that, I wouldn't add anything to what Carla and Sherry have already mentioned.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's move on to special circumstances and appeals. So whenever we hear something that's a little tricky that just can't be noted on the FAFSA or the profile, something outside the box, we often will advise families to contact the financial aid office. If it's a high school senior who's applied to a number of colleges, we'll recommend that they contact the schools that they've been accepted to and or have applied to, depending on what stage of the game they're at, and just find out what's the process to go to submit an appeal. What kind of documentation do the colleges need? So we'll talk about that, and this requires professional judgment on behalf of the financial aid office to change circumstance based on what they've already filed. So there are a number of different circumstances that we'll get into in more detail that you see here about income, assets, for example, and so we'll get right into that right now. So let's first talk about the actual logistics of the appeal. So how does it work on each of your campuses? So I'll start, Carla, I'll start with you. If I have a high school senior who has any of the different circumstances we're going to talk about that might require professional judgment, we'll get into the details of the different circumstances over the next few slides. But what's the process look like, and what sort of documentation do you need? And at what point, and this is for all three of you actually, at what point, especially for these high school seniors, at what point in the process do you want them to submit this information? And the reason why I ask that is because I have talked to colleges who have said, whether you've been accepted or not, if you haven't found out yet, just send us the information. We want to know about your appeal right up front. Whereas some colleges have said, we're not going to look at appeals till after May 1st, till after the decision deadline. So I've seen it run the gamut. So I'd love to hear from each of you just about the procedural process in your office and how that works. So Carla, can you go first?
Sure. So we will accept appeals at, pretty much at any point during the process. They can call before they get their award. They can call after they get their award. They can call us after they've deposited. If we don't have a FAFSA on file, then we wouldn't really be able to do much with it or have much of a conversation with the family. So I do think it's best if they've filed the FAFSA already, so that we have something to go by when they contact us. At our school, I would recommend that the family call us and let us know what the circumstance is, just because as a public university, we have very limited funding. So we can't consider as many appeals and do as much with additional funding for families as, some of the private schools that I worked at where there was a lot of institutional funding and a lot that we could do on appeal. So for us, the situations that we'll consider that are likely to change a family's eligibility enough to give them some additional funding are pretty limited. Most often, loss of income appeals would be the most likely thing that we would look at. But it's good for a family to contact us, because if we have their FAFSA, we can take a look at it, consider what the circumstance is, and then we can tell whether it's going to have enough of an impact on their eligibility where we could actually do something with the appeal. And if we felt that it might change their eligibility, then we would let them know what documentation to send to us. And we just created a new special circumstances form that we're going to have families complete for this, which sort of tells them the circumstances that we'll consider most often and what types of documentation to submit with that form when they send it back to us.
Excellent. How about you, Sherry? How does it work at your office?
So we, like Carla said, we are open to appeals, or what we call pre-appeals, any time really. So once the application's been filed, we're happy to know up front. We read, the profile has a special circumstances section. We read everything there as we're reviewing a file, and sometimes we'll reach out to a family based on what's written there. Maybe they write that the father just lost his job or something like that, and so we'll reach out with the appropriate forms for the family to fill out so that we can consider it up front. Certainly, we probably get most of the data later, so after they've gotten the award. And I would say probably the most common one these days with the advent of prior year is that the income from 2 years ago is not quite representative of what's happening in the current calendar year. So we had a very large uptick in appeals based on current income being much lower than the base year used by the applications. So we had a lot of people trying to document their current calendar year income for us and is making adjustments based on that. We get a lot too based on unreimbursed medical. We ask for documentation of everything. So if someone can't work because of a medical disability, we'll ask for letters from doctors if they lost their job, letters of termination, documentation of unemployment, severance, what they've earned so far this year, all of that. And we also document again at the end of the year, especially if it's I'm expecting to make $50,000 less in 2018 kind of thing. We'll document in December that actually happened, and make adjustments at the end if they over or underestimated, we'll make adjustments. We get a fair number of appeals. I'd say hundreds and hundreds of those as well. And fortunately, we do have the money to respond to that because we are meeting need for students. So we find ourselves in appeal land quite a lot. And we have appeal meetings a couple times a week, going through everything, and we may reach out for more information from families. Not every case ends in additional money. Sometimes the circumstances just don't warrant additional funds in the way that the formula works, or a lot of times families will ask if they can appeal because of their cash flow, their expenses don't make it possible for them to pay the family contribution. We can't consider things like that. We can't consider their actual expenses. We can't consider consumer debt and things like that were more personal choices. So we do sometimes have to have some difficult conversations with families about things like that.
Great, thank you. And how about you, Amy?
Oh, it's so different. Wow. People probably heard me say wow when Sherry was talking. I apologize, but it's just completely the opposite of what Sherry does, and even very different from what Carla does. And most of that is driven by we don't have additional funds to give. So when we are doing a special circumstance appeal, we've already spoken with the family or the student and determined that most likely they can document that they're going to either become Pell eligible or they are going to become a zero EFC. So there's no ability to pay whatsoever, so increase their Pell eligibility. And that's really the only way that we can assist students. Our volume is much, much lower. That may be a function of that students aren't even aware that this process exists, and so they're not asking. We probably do about a dozen special circumstances appeals a semester in the office total. It's just not a process that we are really, we're not doing it very often. And there's probably a number of reasons why. The other thing is we absolutely would not take it before a student has done a FAFSA. We absolutely would require them to do the FAFSA first.
Excellent, excellent. So professional judgment, we're talking a little bit about that. It is, as you can hear, on a case-by-case basis, and it's different from college to college. Very difficult questions and circumstances, and I'm sure you've heard lots of stories. But I just want to pick up on something that Sherry mentioned about decreases in income, particularly with prior year. We get that question a lot here at MEFA as well. So they're reporting 2016, 2015 information, but now they make less. So we will just tell them, talk to the financial aid office. On the profile form, obviously, they're reporting present and future incomes, so it's a little bit different. But on the FAFSA, there's no real way to report, I don't make as much as I did last year or 2 years ago. So we do have families contact the colleges about that, just to document that issue. So that comes up a lot. And any others here in the changes in income that you guys see regularly that you want to touch upon? Carla, any of these ring a bell?
Most of the things on this slide are things that I dealt with far more when I worked at private institutions and used institutional methodology. Kind of like what Amy said at Framingham, because we have limited funding, we don't do as many appeals as a school like Brandeis would do or other private institutions. Because, we already have a lot of students here that are Pell eligible that have very low EFCs. So even if they have a special circumstance, if their EFC is already 0, we can't make it any lower. So then it's really just a question of a small amount of institutional funding that we could provide. And we don't, with our population, we don't really see things like the one-time capital gains, the bonuses, the inheritances, the life insurance distribution. But I saw those things all the time when I worked at private institutions. But we do see things like job losses, reductions in salary, and medical expenses. I mean, those are the things that we're dealing with the most here. And but we will have families that will try to appeal here who have a job loss or a reduction in salary, but sometimes their EFC is so high that they're not going to qualify for need-based aid here because the cost is low, even if we do their appeal for a reduction in income. So that's the other thing we have to deal with too. We have a lot of very high-need students here, but we do have some students who are more, middle income to upper middle income, and those families are sort of surprised that they don't qualify for more need-based aid here, and that's because the cost here is lower and also because we don't have that much money to give.
Right, and I do want to touch upon one point about the bullet that says illness of a family member, or even, loss of a family member. When unfortunately, God forbid, something should happen to a parent, that's a tough call to make, but we want to make sure that students and the surviving parent are calling the college as soon as they're able to let them know that, one of the parents has passed away so that they can make a change in income. Most colleges that I've talked to just say, have them call us. They don't put the students through the ringer on that one. They just make the change, and it may or may not make a change in what they're eligible for, particularly at a lower cost public college. But it is something we want to encourage families to do throughout the calendar year. So I do want to just do a quick time check. I know it's 11 o'clock, so we are going over a little bit, but that's because we're having such a great conversation. So I'm going to keep it moving so that we can get to some questions. So we'll just touch upon the next few slides. We can go through these pretty quickly because I think a lot of them, the process is pretty much the same. But feel free to send questions through the chat feature. So sudden changes in assets. This is something, I get this question a lot. The question I get is, should I take my savings and redo my kitchen now so it looks like I have less money? Or should I save the money, $50,000, whatever it might be, they're worried that that's going to affect their EFC and affect the aid they're getting. So that's the question I get a lot in some way, shape, or form. Should they buy the new house now or should they wait? Because they have a lot of equity in their current home, things like that. So Sherry, I know you probably see this more. The assets probably impact your population a little bit more. What kind of situations do you see, and what will fly as far as professional judgment goes?
Yeah, I'll say there's a lot less leeway, at least for the way we do professional judgment on the asset side. There's not really much you can do for federal with assets. They kind of are what they are. But for the profile, it does ask for information about home equity. So that's something that we have a little bit of flexibility on because it affects only institutional funds. So we will, if a family comes to us and says, hey, I really can't borrow against, with my income, I can't borrow against this home equity. Sometimes we even do things up front. If we see someone's income is so low that they can't borrow, we may cap the equity, reduce it based on their income, what we think a bank would actually lend them, regardless of credit, like what would be the most that a bank would give them based on their income level. So some of those things we do up front if it's a very low income family. Sometimes we do it on appeal. So it is worthwhile for families to call us and ask about the home equity piece and how much equity we're looking at and what's realistic for them in terms of borrowing ability. We also we make an assumption based on the year they bought the house, what it should be worth now. So we might be using, even though they said it's worth $200,000, we might be using $300,000 because it looks like it should be worth more than that. And they can document for us that it actually is worth that lower amount, either using recent assessments or we can, sometimes we'll use Zillow to look at that. So it's definitely a good idea for them to ask some questions about how we're treating the assets. But on the federal side, there's not a whole lot you can do with, cash and savings and things like that, even if they need to use it for, I'll say I've never done a professional judgment where I've excluded assets because they needed it for sudden emergencies. I've actually never done that.
Great. Okay, great. I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I'll throw this one over to Amy to see, do you see any of these? You can touch upon assets if you have anything to add there, but any changes in household expenses that you guys would consider? I know that we get the question a lot about parents who have their own student loan debt. Do schools consider that? I know maybe, medical bills, especially high child care costs, maybe that's something that's looked at.
I have to honestly say, I have not seen any of these. We almost exclusively get the special circumstances appeal because of the loss of income or a death of a parent or an income earner in the household.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, like I kind of alluded to, I think there's a few things that happen here. Carla said it really well, that we're already so inexpensive that there's not a lot we can do for middle income families. So I think that's why we're not getting those appeals. We can't get them to a range where they'd be eligible for federal money that's different than what they're already getting. And then the second piece is we just don't have these types of expenses in the students and the households that we are dealing with as our student population. And there may be a little piece that if we went out and did some education around this eligibility, maybe we would have more appeals based on things like high child care costs or special schools for siblings, things like that. But this just isn't something we see really at all.
Great, thank you. And Carla, do you see any of these, or even in your previous private school world, did you see many of these that you would actually consider?
So the first one, private elementary or secondary school tuition, I think really varies among schools. We would not consider that here at Framingham, and we didn't consider it at the private schools I worked at either, but some private schools do, and some private schools will consider it sort of automatically as an allowance when they're considering what to award students based on institutional methodology. We do see the medical appeals sometimes. And for some of our independent students, because we do have a little bit higher population of those students, we sometimes, some of those students have childcare costs that they need some assistance with. And usually, if we have one of those appeals, it would really just be to add those costs to the cost of attendance so that the students could borrow a loan to help cover it. You know, most of the students in that situation already qualify for as much financial aid as we can give them. So it's really just an ability to allow them to borrow a little bit more to help with those expenses.
Great, great. Thank you. And then I'm going to keep moving. But Sherry, did you have anything to add on this one? Any that you actually would consider?
Yeah, so the medical and dental not covered by insurance, we are for our institutional money, and actually sometimes for federal too, depending, you know, if it makes a difference at all. We would consider that. So if it's on the Schedule A for the parents and they can provide an explanation as to why they're so high, we will include that. Student loan payments, if it's the parent student loan payments, what we would do is so they document it on appeal, and we would include it as reducing the equity in their home. So we'd increase the debt on their home by it, knowing that having that debt makes them less able to borrow a loan for the student. The high child care costs, that would be something that we would add to a cost of attendance. So we see that on the graduate side, probably more than our undergraduate population. We don't really, we probably have maybe 1 or 2 undergraduate students who actually have children of their own, maybe not even that many. And we do not consider private elementary or secondary school tuition at all.
Yeah, and
we consider that a choice.
Oh, thank you. The only thing I would mention about the private school is the only time I tell families that colleges might consider it is if the secondary school, the student needs to go there for medical purposes, you know, for a disability or something like that. Then a college, they may consider that. I've heard of that before. So, you know, that's just something.
We do occasionally do that. Yeah, right. If they can prove that they're there, that they absolutely have to be there because they can't get the same education for their disability in the public system, we will consider it, but it won't be the full cost.
Right.
But we will consider a portion. Yep, that's a good point.
Great. And I know we talked about this already a little bit, change in household size, whether, you know, God forbid somebody should pass away. Do you guys, Amy, do you get any of these throughout the year? I know you mentioned, you know, if somebody...
We don't usually get them as changes during the year. I can't remember that actually ever happening. But like I said, when we were talking about the different household definitions, we have many iterations of this. You know, parents who are divorced still living in the same household for years. We have many generations of a family living in a household. We have folks who take in kids that aren't theirs and can prove that they're supporting them. We see all of that, but we're not doing it as changes on appeal.
Great, great, thank you. Okay, and just for sake of time, I just want to go to one more. Sherry, you had mentioned this earlier. And Carla, I don't know if this is something that comes up at your school very often. Cost of attendance adjustments. Carla, do you make a lot of these changes for students? I know you touched upon it briefly.
Yeah, I actually just did one of these the other day because we had a student whose laptop died, and she needed to purchase a new one. And her need was almost met. So we did add the cost of that. You know, I got documentation from her of what she expected the computer to cost. And we were able to help her out by adding that to the cost of attendance so that she could either take a loan or, in this case, I had a little bit of grant money, so I was able to offer her that to help with it. Travel expenses would typically come into play if a student goes on a study abroad semester. Sometimes you make adjustments to the cost of attendance for that, or if somebody you know, we don't have a lot of students here that come from out of state or come from far away. But if you did have somebody who came from, you know, a different region of the country we might have to adjust the standard travel expenses and our cost of attendance to account for that. And then sometimes we will have a student come forward and say that their books cost more than expected. So if they can provide us like with a receipt from the bookstore or some other documentation, then sometimes we'll increase the cost so that they can get a loan to help with those extra books.
Great. And Sherry, can you touch upon the high cost of living bullet here? And what I mean by that is we get questions a lot when we're talking to families who maybe live in a very high cost area, and they want to know, how do schools look at that? Do they even consider that? They may not make a lot, but can you just touch upon that?
Yeah, so this one's a tough one. I actually had an hour-long conversation with a family yesterday about this. They live in New York City, and their expenses are just exorbitantly high.
That was not planted, by the way.
Well, actually, it's funny, you didn't even know, but I literally just had this conversation yesterday. We don't consider, there's no way to consider that, really. So the formula, the institutional formula, just like the federal formula, looks at how much you pay in state taxes, and that's really the only piece that actually looks where you live. So unfortunately, it treats you the same if you live in New York or Idaho. So it can be really tough. I mean, I had to have a really difficult conversation with this family that even though their expenses were so high, I couldn't consider their actual expenses. I had to use, we had to use the formula. That was one piece where I couldn't do a professional judgment for them. I could look at lower income, I could look at medical expenses, I could look at so many other things, but I can't tweak how much of a living allowance is given. And that living allowance is not based on the state that you live in. And that's the same with the federal formula as well. So I know that the College Board offers an alternative formula where some schools may be using something that's indexed more to the state in terms of cost of living. But my understanding is it's only like a few thousand more. So it really wouldn't make a huge difference, I don't think, even if we were to use that other method. So, I mean, unfortunately, it comes down to a family decision as to whether they feel that they can afford it, given the expenses they have in the state that they live in.
Yeah, and I had some families, I work with families that live on Martha's Vineyard. So they're not necessarily wealthy, but they live there year round. And obviously their cost of living is much higher than even somebody maybe living in anywhere in Massachusetts, really, except maybe inner city Boston. And I've talked to families who've documented how much more it costs for bread, for milk, things like that. So when they were able to, but it's going to require a lot of work on the families. So just in the sake of time, I just want to keep things moving and talk about the gap. So when there's a legitimate gap, whether it's just covering the family's EFC or it's just unmet need, depending on what school you're at. How do you approach these conversations with families on how to pay the balance due? So I'll start with you, Amy, because you might see things, we'll start from the lowest to the highest, lowest cost to the highest cost.
We're really just looking at counseling families on how to understand their EFC and how that impacts eligibility for grants and loans, and what that means in terms of the student's bill and any cost of direct expenses like books and supplies. And we are really, for the most part, counseling around this in different ways than I'm sure Carla or Sherry are going to talk about. For the most part, our students are asking for more loans than they actually need. And that is because our cost of attendance is so low, but the amount of loan that they're able to borrow is the same as a school like Brandeis. And so we have students that are actually borrowing plus getting grant funds, and it's well beyond what their build charges and their books and supplies and other things are that they actually need to pay for school.
Because they're borrowing for cost of living.
They are borrowing for cost of living, right, and often also working and able to manage their cost of living. They just, very jaded about it. They like to have the big check come in, which is something that is a function of community colleges and probably not a huge function of the other institutions. But that piece we cancel around a lot because we want them to have that borrowing available when they transfer to a four-year institution. And we don't want them, if they're not continuing on, we don't want them graduating from a community college with all of their borrowing for a four-year degree having been used here, which is still allowed by federal guidelines. They can borrow up to the maximum allowed for a four-year degree and not go beyond a two-year degree. And so we do a lot of counseling around that. We don't find a lot of students or families trying to figure out how to fill a gap between aid and what they can actually afford, because we have payment plans and, like I said, much lower cost of attendance for being here.
Great, excellent. And how about you, Carla?
So for us, if we have high need students that are planning to live on campus, then they most likely will have a gap, and we're not able to fill it with financial aid because we don't have the funding. So we'll talk to them about different things. We have a monthly payment plan like most schools. There's parent loans, there's additional private loans that students can take with a co-signer. We encourage them to apply for outside scholarships. And then if they really can't find a way to fill the gap, then we might counsel them if they're within commuting distance. It's, for a lot of our high need students, they can pretty much cover the cost of financial aid if they choose to commute rather than living on campus. So if they live close enough to do that and they have transportation, that's a conversation that we often have with them. If it's really not affordable for the family, or they're not willing to pay the cost and don't have a lot of other options, then we do sometimes counsel students about taking some time and going to the community colleges first. We have a lot of students here that will go to Mass Bay since they're in the same area, and then we'll transfer in here after a year or two there. We also have several partnership programs with them. So that's another option for some of our students. And then depending on where the student lives and where they're coming from, then we might counsel them to consider one of the other community colleges and then transfer back to us. That's also a conversation we have with students after they've started here, if they're struggling academically or financially, or even on a personal level. Sometimes students will come here for a semester or two, find that they're struggling with one of those different aspects, and sometimes it benefits them to take a semester or two away from Framingham and go to one of the community colleges and then come back.
Excellent. And how about you, Sherry?
So we certainly have a lot of conversations about this. I mean, fortunately, we offer packages that meet the need with loans, work, and scholarship. But certainly, sometimes the families feel like still what's left over to pay is just too much. And so we definitely have a lot of, we walk through what all the appeal possibilities might be. And then once we get to what the final amount's going to be that they need to pay, we talk about a lot of the same things that Carla just said. I mean, we talk about payment plans, we talk about student and parent loans. We definitely encourage the parent borrowing over the student borrowing, because just with the loans that they get, the federal loans that they get from us, so we feel like that's probably plenty for the student to take on. But we do have some families that choose to have the student take on the borrowing with the parent as a co-signer. We encourage also combining the payment plan with loans so that they borrow as little as possible, even the parents, so that they don't borrow everything. We explain it's not an all or nothing. You don't have to pay the whole thing on a payment plan. You don't have to pay the whole thing on a loan. You can make combinations of things. So if they know how much they can afford per month, we can help them work that out. Do this amount on a payment plan, do this amount on a loan to get to that amount that you can afford per month. So we also talk about students applying for private scholarships through their guidance offices. So talking to all of you as to how to apply for those, because even if it's just for the first year, I mean, that could be less loan or less family contribution that they might have to pay for that first year. And then, beyond that, some private student and parent loan options that we have out there on Elm Select. So we have some pretty extensive conversations with people, but we try to discourage excessive borrowing as much as possible.
Excellent, great. So I have just a few wrap-up comments. I want to encourage everybody while we're wrapping up the webinar to type in your questions. I know I have one good one that I'm going to get to in a second, but I do want to just sort of wrap up with a couple of closing thoughts here. Just a few bullets here that we've heard throughout our webinar of things that typically aren't considered in an appeal, and that's really choices on how folks are spending their money. So credit card debt, for example, car payments. The only thing I tell families is maybe if the credit card debt is for an unreimbursed medical expense, then they may be able to talk to a college about that. But these are typically things that colleges aren't going to consider. And I also want to remind folks that we do have a couple of great webinars coming up. So we have MEFA pathway demos. Definitely check those out if you haven't seen the new MEFA pathway. We have an After the Acceptance or Understanding Your Financial Aid Award Letters webinar coming up at the beginning of April. This one is for counselors. So we'll basically walk you through what we're helping families with in late March and April, which is the After the College Acceptance. So here's the upcoming webinars for families that we are offering. In April, we will have a lot of regional seminars for After the College Acceptance in late March and April, where we will be going over financial aid award letters, explaining the different components of an award letter, talking to families about crafting a plan to pay that college bill. So we will go through those details that Amy, Carla, and Sherry just talked about with families before they deposit on May 1st, to help them come up with a strategy so that they know that whatever school they're sending their son or daughter to, or students, before they sign on the dotted line and are borrowing, we want them to feel comfortable with that choice, at least from a financing perspective. So these are great programs. You will be hearing from us, school counselors. We hope that you'll share this with your families and get folks to come to these seminars or join us on a webinar. If families are not able to attend a seminar and they want to come into Boston, if they live or work nearby, we're able to help them in person as well, or they can join our webinar that is coming up in April, and we'll be recording those as well. So keep an eye out for those. It's after the college acceptance season, so we're excited about that. So I am going to open it up for questions. I do have one that I'm going to bring up in a second, but here's our phone number, website. So just a couple closing thoughts, and I'll then answer some questions. I want to thank Sherry, Amy, and Carla for joining us today. Really appreciate all your great guidance and expertise. It's just invaluable for us to be able to share that information with counselors who can then help families with all this great info. And we did record the webinar, so I'll share that with everybody via email for everybody who registered. So feel free to share this with others in your office that might not have been able to attend. And I will attach the handout. If anybody needs a certificate of attendance for the webinar, feel free to email me. I'll send a chat right now with my email if you need it. But I do have one question that I just want to throw out there. And if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to send those in before we end our webinar. So I'm going to throw this question out there. So I'll just read it directly. It says, I have a student who is a citizen, but her parents are undocumented. I was told that the student's parents should still fill out the FAFSA and report all zeros for the Social Security number. Is this accurate? This student is overly cautious and hesitant about filling out the form to begin with. If you have any experience with a situation like that, could you speak to that? So I'll just mention, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists, that we do get that question a lot, and particularly in today's environment, folks are very, very cautious and very concerned about this. So I'll start with you, Amy. Do you have any advice for this student? And I'm assuming this information is accurate, putting the zeros in there, but
I have heard that before, Stephanie, and I honestly have never had the question come to me, and I honestly don't know that I would advise someone to do that. Maybe Sherry or Carla is the better person to answer it. That's not something I would recommend. I don't think the student should be doing a FAFSA, but maybe I'm really misguided on that.
Yeah, the student is a citizen, but her parents are undocumented. So the student would fill out their Social Security, and the parents would fill out all zeros. Carla, Sherry, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, that's correct. So the student would absolutely fill out a FAFSA because they would be eligible for federal aid. However, so we've had quite a few cases like this. The parents can put the zeros in there for the purposes of the Social Security number match if they don't have a Social Security number, which I'm assuming they don't. But depending on what level of income they report on the FAFSA, they would have had to have filed a tax return. So we had a case just this year, actually, where the same thing, student was a citizen, parents were undocumented, they filed the FAFSA, the parents said that they made $24,000, which was over the threshold for being required to file a tax return. And we contacted the student and said, we need a copy of your parents' tax return. And she said, oh, well, they didn't do it, and they're afraid to do it, and which I understand. But we could not qualify her for federal aid because she was selected for verification, and the FAFSA was rejected because the income was over the threshold for filing, and the parents had not filed. So that could be a tricky part of that situation. Now, if they make under the filing threshold, it'll go through just fine. But if they're over the filing threshold, they are required to file a tax return, and they should be able to apply for a taxpayer ID number, different than a Social Security number. But they can file the FAFSA with zeros to at least get the application going. But there may be an issue on the other side regarding how much income they have and whether they filed the tax return or not.
Excellent. And Carla, did you have anything to add?
No, what Sherry is saying is correct, and it's not just undocumented parents that will be affected by this. You sometimes have students that live here that are citizens or permanent residents, but their parents live in a foreign country.
Yep.
And those parents also would not have a Social Security number. So that is the correct guidance. Sometimes the FAFSA comes back rejected, and then somebody from one of the schools that the student is applying to can go into the government system and sort of confirm that the zeros are correct to be reported for the Social Security number. And then the only other thing that I think might be an issue is that those parents will probably need to sign a paper. They'll probably have to print out the signature page from the FAFSA. I don't think they'd be able to get an FSA ID without a Social Security number to sign the form electronically. So they probably have to do that. They probably have to print out the signature page, sign it, and mail it in. So it's definitely a little more complicated to do the form for those families. And then as far as the concern about, not wanting to reveal themselves as non-citizens, that's really understandable right now. But the bottom line is similar to what Sherry was saying. We can't give the student federal aid unless they do this. So if they want to be considered for it, they really have no choice but to go through this process.
Great. Excellent.
Well, and you can see how complicated financial aid is that I learned something new today.
We always, I learned something new as well every day.
Yep.
This was great. Well, thank you, Amy, Sherry, and Carla for all your expertise. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I don't see any other questions coming in, so I'm going to end the webinar. I know we went a lot over, but it was a great conversation. So I think it was well worth the time. So thanks everybody for joining us, and just keep an eye out on your email, and I will be following up in the next day or two with the recording and a copy of the handout. Thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.